Hi everyone, my name is Mark Moykins from Big Mountain Studio, and today we're going to continue on this animation series where I teach you a new technique for animating, which is the spring animation. And the spring animation is a lot of fun, as you're going to see here. This is what we're going to learn. Basically, we're going to start with this simple app that does nothing, but when you click the sync button, it's going to give you this message that pops up. And I spring it into place. So let's look at that again. Notice it had some bounce to it. Well, that's what the spring animation is. And I'm going to show you another option for animating too. And that is with springing something using rotation. Okay, so let's get started. So basically what's happening there is I'm applying some transform to this pop-up. This first one, I'm doing a scale. So I'm scaling it into a weird shape and then I'm bouncing it back to its original shape. And then with this animation, I'm basically just rotating it, and then I'm bouncing it back into its original position. So let me show you how to do that. Okay, so here's my window. And the first thing I need to do is I need to be able to apply some transforms to this pop-up. So I need some outlets. I have nothing in my view controller here now. Okay, so let's create some outlets here. Need one for the pop-up. And you might notice that this object is a little bit different, the visual effect view. That's a normal blur, the visual effect view with the blur, but it has an X on it. And that's basically because I created a custom class. So I was able to, well, let's just, here, I'll show you on the properties here. Oops, go on the pop-up. So my custom class basically exposes 3 properties. So I can set the border width, and the corner radius. That's all. Okay, so we have our visual effect view, and then we're also going to wire up the sync button. So when I click that, we can show the pop-up. That's going to be an action. Okay, then we need one more for the OK button to close it again. I'll just call it OK. Oops, create an outlet. Do you guys ever do that? I do that all the time. So I just come up here. If you create something accidentally and then you delete the outlet, you have to come in here and remove it, or else it'll cause trouble in the future. And it's going to be in action. Okay. So basically, the pop-up, we don't want that visible when we first start the application. So I'm going to change the alpha property to 0. Yeah, we don't really need this anymore. So let's just go into full screen on our code window here. And then when I click on sync, I want to show that pop-up. So I'll just say set the alpha to 1. And then when I click OK, I'm going to hide the pop-up. Okay, let's see what that looks like right now, just to make sure everything's working. All right, that works perfect. So notice, when you show something with no animation, it's kind of boring, right? And that's what I'm trying to teach you guys, how to create a better user experience. Even just a little bit of animation there will create a much better user experience. All right, so what do we need to do? When I click this sync button, well, I'm going to show the pop-up, but then I'm also I want to animate it. So the way to do that is, remember I told you, what I did was I applied a transform to the pop-up. So you do that by setting the transform property and use CGAffineTransform. And if you watched my previous video, you should know what this means by now. Affine basically means it preserves parallel relationships. So all the transforms that you do, they don't actually warp or skew the object. They maintain sort of like the parallel sides. So it maintains parallel relationships on the object. So even if you rotate it, you scale it, or you translate basically means moving it from point A to point B. So if you do any of those things with it, it'll still maintain the parallel sides of your object. What we want to do is we want to scale it. And that basically means if you scale it on the x-axis, like right here, that'll make it, you can make it more narrow or wider. So what we'll do is we'll make it really narrow. We'll make it 0.3% smaller than it is. And then for the Y, let's make it a little bit taller. So we'll make it 2 times as tall as normal. When you do a transform, if these values are 1, then the size of the object won't change at all. So if you make it less than 1, it'll make it smaller. If you make it greater than 1, it'll make it bigger. Now the technique that I'm using here, you've seen in previous videos, where I transform something and then I animate it back to its original size or original position. And that's exactly what we're going to do. And you probably know the function already, or how to even get there, because I try to have you guys memorize it. It's uiview.animate. And make sure you memorize that, because you'll be using it all the time. Okay, and this is, you see there's many different animates, but this first one is the one that we're going to be using. And the thing you want to look for is right here, using springWithDamping. Okay, I'm going to describe to you what that means as we go through the parameters here. Okay, the time interval, I'm going to go with 1, just because I want that's sort of like a longer animation. Normally, my animations are less than 1. But for this purpose, I want to keep it at 1 so you guys can really see the animation and the effect that is created. For delay, I'm not going to delay at all. I want the animation to happen right away. Now, springWithDamping, what does that mean? It's a value between 0 and 1. 0 means you're not damping the spring action at all. It is just going to bounce all over the place. That spring is going to be wild. And then a 1 means that you're going to be totally damping out the spring. There's going to be no bounce whatsoever. So we want something in between. Usually what I do is I start with a 0.5 and then see how it looks, and then I make it a little bit more, a little bit less. If I want more spring, I lower the number. If I want less spring, I raise that number. And initial spring velocity, Apple describes that as how fast was it moving before the spring was applied. And you can actually, here, let's hold down Control and click on Animate and look at the notes here, because I want to show you something that I learned from Apple here. It's this last line right here. You'll typically want to pass 0 for the velocity, and that is normally what I do. I usually don't mess with the velocity. If my animation isn't coming out the way I want, then I might look into velocity and maybe raise it to see what it looks like, because maybe I need it to start off a little bit faster. But normally, I always just set it to 0. Very rarely have I ever used something that wasn't 0 for the velocity. Okay, options. Options are available on another one of the animate functions, but I'm going to describe it here just so, because the more I describe it, the more you'll get it. I'm not quite sure if I ever described this before, but I will now. Okay, let's hit dot and see what our options are. These are the most common options right here. The curves. Curve linear means the animation will start and end going at the same speed. So if there's a bounce, it's going to be bouncing at the same speed from beginning to end. And if you have a curve ease in, that means the bounce will start off slowly. Or I should say animation, because these options apply not just to springWithDamping. It applies to other animations as well. So curve ease in means it starts out slower than normal, and then it speeds up to the normal speed. And curve ease out is just the opposite. It starts off and goes at the normal speed, and toward the end, it'll slow down. I usually use like a curve ease out if I'm animating objects onto the screen, like text fields and buttons, because it has a nicer effect when it comes in kind of fast and then it slows down and stops at its destination. It slows down toward the end of the animation. Curve ease in and out, that basically means it starts off slow and ends slow. So it starts off slow, speeds up, and then ends off slowing down. But there's another option here too. This one right here, this is the one that I'm interested in. Allow user interaction. And the reason why I want to use that is because I'm animating a button. Normally what happens is when animation takes place, the user interaction enabled property on all the objects becomes false. You cannot click on them, you cannot interact with them. You can't do anything with them until the animation is over. I want to give the users the option to be able to click that OK button if the animation is still going. So I'm going to use this option right here. And I'll just show you something here. Show you what I mean. Okay, this OK button, if you look down at the UI view properties, it's this option right here. When the animation is taking place, this gets disabled, so you can't click on that button anymore. And when the animation stops, this option gets re-enabled at the end of the animation, so now the user can interact with it again. So what I'm doing is with that option, I'm always keeping it enabled. They can't turn that off. Now, if I didn't want any options, if I just wanted to go with the default, I could just do this, pass in an empty array. And it is an array because I can pass in multiple options here. I might want to allow user interaction and curve ease in, for example. But for now, I just want allow user interaction. And we don't really need these. Okay, and of course the next part is the animation itself. So what do I want to do? It's pretty simple. I'm just basically animating it back to its original position by setting the identity back to the transform, or setting the transform back to identity. Identity is basically kind of like the default transform. It's removing all transforms that have been applied to this object, so it's back to its default state. And for success, for the completion, I'm going to leave this in here because we may need that in the future. Okay, let's check this out, see what happens. Okay, I click on sync. Oh, it's awesome. Look at that. I might want to give it just a little bit more bounce, but already you can see this has a better user experience. It's more entertaining, I guess you could say. Okay, I'm going to give it more bounce by lowering the damping. The lower the number, the more bounce it has. And let's try 0.3, see what that looks like. There we go. See how much more bouncy it is? All right, great. That's awesome. Okay, now I showed you another animation too, the swinging animation, right? So let's show you how that's done. Now at this point, you could stop the video. The swinging animation, that's just kind of like another option. But I think you have the general idea down. Basically, the technique that I'm using is I'm transforming the object somehow, and then I'm animating it back to its original state. And that's exactly what we're going to do with the swinging action that you saw at the beginning of the video. Okay, so let's continue. The first thing we have to do is I want to show that switch that we had on there. So let's change that back to 1 so we can see it. And now that we have it, I'll need now that we can see it, I'll need an outlet for it too. And I don't know, I'll call it the hanging effect switch, because that's the animation it'll be turning on. Okay, good. So let's go back to full screen. And it's going to be up here. So basically, if the hanging effect switch is on, then that means we want to show that effect. Else, we want to do this transform. Okay, so can you imagine, I want you to think about this, what transform will I have to apply to create that swinging effect that it had before? There's only 3 transforms that we've really covered. Let's take a look. Okay, these are basically your choices. Translation, that is basically, it's a math term, which basically means moving something from point A to point B. So we're not doing any moving, we're not repositioning anything. Scaling, that means making things bigger, smaller, or changing the width or the height of something. So we're not really doing that. But the rotation, that is actually what we're going to use, because we're actually just going to rotate the object to a certain point, and then we're going to animate it back to its original spot. So you can guess that it will bounce back and forth as it animates back to its original position. Now, what it's looking for here, remember, we covered this in the previous video, it's not looking for degrees, like the rotation of degrees, like 90 degrees, 45 degrees. Instead, what it's looking for are radians. And normally what I do is I just open up a browser and I say degrees to radians, and I type in the degrees and I see what radians that equals. So I did that, and I came up with 1.8, which is basically a little bit over 90 degrees. So I'm going to rotate the pop-up like a little over 90 degrees. I think it's more like 100 degrees. And then I'm going to bounce it back into its position. Now let's just see what that looks like. Okay, we got to turn the switch on. There we go. Now it's not quite what I showed you in the beginning, right? This is more like it's rotating from the center. And that is because when rotations happen, the rotations actually happen around an invisible anchor point, which of course you can't see. But that anchor point, by default, is right in the center of the object. And that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing a rotation that's happening right around the center point, in the middle of this view, this pop-up. So what we want to do is we want to move that anchor point up toward the top in the center. So then when it rotates around this anchor point. And then when we sync it, it swings back to its original position, but bounces back and forth. And that's basically what's happening when I showed you at the beginning of the video. So how do we move the anchor point? Well, this was a big source of pain for me when I first learned the anchor point. Because let me just show you what happens here. Now, setting the anchor point is pretty simple. It's on the layer. And then there's a property actually called anchor point. And as you can see, it's a CG point. So the CG point is basically just an X and Y coordinate. And you might say, wow, Mark, that sounds really simple. What's the problem? Wait till I show you. Okay. Now, here's the default. By default, that is what the anchor point is set to. 0.5, 0.5. And you might think that sounds kind of strange. And it kind of does. But it's using a different type of scale here. And let me describe this here. Basically, the scale has, you have an X and your Y coordinate. And it starts at 0, 0, which is in the upper left-hand corner. And as the X goes across the object, it always ends at 1. When it reaches the end of the object, it's at 1. And think of that as percentage, 100%. It can't be more than 100%. Actually, it can. You can move the anchor point right off the object itself. But for this demonstration, for this description, the end of the object ends at 1, at 100%. And same with the y-axis. It starts at 0 in the upper left-hand corner, and it goes down, and it ends at 1, at the bottom of the object. Now, like I said, you can go less than 0, and you can go more than 1 if you want to move the anchor point off the object. And sometimes you might want to do that. But what do we need? We want to move the anchor point here. Let's take a look here. So remember, for the anchor point, 0, 0 is right here. For the x-axis, 1 is here. For the y-axis, 1 is here. And in this corner, the anchor point will be 1, 1, 100%, 100%. So right now it's at 50%, 50%, which is right here. So really we want it up here. And this is the x-axis. So we want it 50% of the x-axis, which puts us in the middle. And on the y-axis, we're not going down. We're not moving anywhere. So the y-axis will be 0. So y will be 0. And we're going to keep the x-axis as 0.5. Now you think, oh, that was easy, Mark. So what's the problem? Let me show you. Okay. Let's turn the rotation on. What just happened? This is why it's not as easy as it looks. Because what happens is when you move the anchor point, you might have the concept that, oh yeah, the anchor point will move and the object will stay in its original position. No, the opposite just happened. The anchor point, we move the anchor point, we set it to a new position, but the anchor point never moves. And that is something you have to remember. Keep that in your mind. The anchor point never moves. The object moves around the anchor point. So when you change the anchor point here, no, the anchor point isn't going to move. It's going to move the object around it. So the anchor point is like a rock. It doesn't move. Everything moves around it. And that is why it is a hassle. So what we have to do is, even though we moved the anchor point to be on the top center, you'd think it would have been up here, but no, the anchor point, you might notice, this is still the center, the original center of the object. So what we have to do is basically adjust the view to accommodate for the center. So we have to take the view now and move it back up here. Well, what happened? the view basically moved half as much down. It moved 50% of its height downward. So we have to move it 50% of its height back up. And the easiest way to do that is to use the center property right here. Because with the center property, these aren't read-only values. You can change these values, like they have a getter and a setter. Whereas another way that you could change it is like using the frame, but the frame is read-only. You'd have to create a new frame with new dimensions. So that's why I like to use the center property, because you can just, all we're going to do is change the Y property, and it's that simple. Okay, so to do this, basically what we're going to do is we're going to take the existing Y property, and we have to move it back up. So that means we have to subtract half of the height of the pop-up. So let's just get the height of the pop-up. And you can get that a couple of ways, through the bounds or through the frame height. There we go. And we're going to divide that by 2. And that will give us 50% of the height of the pop-up. We'll subtract it from Y, which will push it back up. Oh, and there's one more thing. Okay, well, I'll just show you. Oh, wrong animation. Let's turn that switch on. There we go. Way better, right? That is exactly what we wanted. but watch what happens. Whoa, where's my pop-up going? So basically, it's this line of code right here. We're changing the center. Every time we click on the button, it moves the frame up higher and higher and higher. So what we can do is just after the animation, we could just reset that. So we'll say self.popup, and we'll change the center. So what I could do here is I could just reverse this like this. So instead of subtracting it, I'm going to add it back. But the problem, I need some selfs in here. But the problem with this is, we have a couple of different animations. We have 2 different animations. If we come through this path, then this will be fine. But if we come through this path, it's going to change the position. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable that holds the original center of the object and just reapply it back. Original center. And it's a CG point. Yeah. And I'm putting an exclamation point on it because I'm guaranteeing that it's going to have a value. There we go. So when the page first loads, or when the view controller first loads, I'm going to save the original center and just reapply it. That way, no matter which animation I use, it's not going to affect it. All right, and another thing I want to do too is, we're changing the CG point, and this is probably okay if we keep applying it, because here it doesn't matter. We're not doing anything with the CG point. It's not going to affect anything. But I would feel better if we just reset this back. That way, if you guys are playing with it, and trying different things, then it'll still work for you. And remember, the default. What's the default? Yeah, it's 0.5, 0.5. It's right in the center. Anchor point is right in the center of the object. All right, that should do it. Let's test that one last time. Whoa, and see how that looks. Okay, there we go. So click on the switch. Oh, what happened here? You see how it's like popping down? And what? I think I know exactly what's happening here. Yeah, this is it right here. So see, I'm doing the transform first, and then I'm modifying its height or its center property. We don't want to do that because doing the transform will change the position of the object. So instead, you want to apply the transform after you adjusted the anchor point and its center property. So that should fix it. Yeah, I've been caught with that mistake before. So that's why I recognized it right away. Okay, let's try it now. All right, that looks good. It's working perfectly. And see how it's being reset and it's starting and it's coming back to its original position every single time. All right, guys, that's all I have for you. I hope you learned some cool stuff with this animation. And And I hope you really understand that the main concept of what I'm doing here. The main concept is you transform and change an object somehow. Either, its rotation angle, or you scale it, or you change its position, and then you're animating it back to its original position. This time, we're just doing it with a spring, so it has a cooler effect to it, gives it that bounce. But that's basically the main thing I want you to remember, is you can do a lot of cool animations by changing the object somehow, transforming the object somehow, and then animating it back to its original position. All right, thanks guys. I really had a lot of fun teaching you guys spring animations. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you learned something new and you want your friends to learn it, go ahead and share this video with them using the share button down below. And consider subscribing, because I'm going to be coming out with more cool tutorials just like this in the future. All right, thanks.